Hello, I'm Steve Lusk with the Red Bank Church of Christ, and joining me today is Matt Wallace, one of our adult Sunday school teachers, and we're here to share with you another in our series of studies from the book of Acts that we're calling Disciples in Action. You may remember that Dr. Luke wrote his gospel to a man named Theophilus in order to set in order the things in Jesus' life. And so he tells the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. And then the book of Acts is another discourse to this Theophilus with intent of telling what the followers of Jesus did after Jesus ascended into heaven. And the key verse in starting the book of Acts is Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where Jesus told his disciples that they would be his witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so the book of Acts unfolds how they did that, how they followed that ripple effect of taking the gospel, starting in Jerusalem in Acts 2, and then spreading on to Judea and Samaria, especially in Acts 8 and 8 through 10, and then beginning with Paul's ministry, his conversion, and then his ministry to the Gentiles, how the gospel is taken to the ends of the earth. And we're in this last section of the book of Acts that really begins about chapter 20, when Paul is finishing up his third missionary journey, and he calls for the Ephesian elders at Miletus and has this moving discourse with them, and is sent off going to Jerusalem in order to do something good. He's taking a gift, an offering that had been collected for Christians in Jerusalem among the Christians in Asia Minor, who were primarily Gentiles. So this was a goodwill offering that was going to help the Jerusalem and Judean Christians because there'd been a famine in that part of the earth. And so Paul was going to do good, and he gets in trouble. Beginning in chapter 21, there's this ruckus in Jerusalem because Paul is accused of defiling the temple and all kinds of things. And there's probably some baggage that has gone along with this because some Asian Jews, some Jews from Asia Minor had sort of followed Paul to Jerusalem and stirred up trouble. And so in chapter 22, he speaks to the mob, and this gets him stirred up again. He has to be rescued and imprisoned by the Romans just to protect him. Chapter 23, then he appears before the Sanhedrin Council and offers a defense, and then he is sent on to Caesarea in order to stand trial as a Roman citizen, because his Roman citizenship is discovered at the end of chapter 23. Chapter 24, he appears before a governor, Felix, and then at the end of chapter 24, Felix is out of office, but he leaves Paul in prison in order to sort of appease the Jews. And that's where we find ourselves with a new governor here in the beginning of Acts chapter 25. This lesson is entitled, I Appeal to Caesar, because this sort of leads us to how Paul winds up going to Rome. So, that's a very brief and hurried description of how we got to this point, Matt, but let's just jump in here. And we always want to encourage you, if you're watching at home or with a life group or just on your own as you have time, take your time and read these passages more carefully than we're going to have time to share today. But we'll hit the highlights here, and we'll ask some key questions that really focus on two things. Number one, how did the early Christians in this history of the first century Christians in the book of Acts, how did they carry out the Great Commission? How did they go and make disciples of others? And one of the key characters throughout this book is Paul and how he made disciples. And then the application part of this that we're trying to investigate and absorb is, how do we, as 21st century disciples of Jesus, how do we also carry out the Great Commission? How do we make disciples? So we'll see if there's some lessons that we can learn as we go along here. So Festus is the new governor following Felix, and he's only been in the province, in this region of Judea, for 3 days. And so he goes from Caesarea, his sort of headquarters, the Herodian palace there, to Jerusalem. He did this because the Jews were his main constituents, and it was very important for Rome to maintain the peace, and the Jews always seemed to be stirring up something, and so the Roman governors were very careful to appease the Jews. The very first thing, it seems at least, that the chief priests and the Jewish leaders who met with him on this occasion, just 3 days after he arrives, the first thing they bring up is Paul. We've got this problem with Paul. And so they request that Paul gets transferred from Caesarea, where he's been imprisoned in Herod's palace for 2 years now, bring him to Jerusalem, because remember, back in a previous chapter, there had been a group of men who had vowed that they were not going to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. So they were planning to ambush him. So Festus just says, no, he's being held at Caesarea. I'm going to go back there pretty soon. You guys come with me, and if he's done anything wrong, then we'll talk about it there. We'll bring up the charges. So he spends about a week and a half with them, and he goes down to Caesarea, taking some of these Jewish leaders with him. And he convenes the court and orders that Paul be brought in. So these Jews that had come down from Jerusalem stood around Paul as he comes in, and they bring these charges against him without any proof. They just accuse him. I just picture kind of a rapid fire. He did this, and he did this, and he did this, but there was no proof. There were no witnesses. There was no documentation of anything that he'd done wrong. And so then Paul says, and this is key in verse 8, I've done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. And those were the 3 primary accusations that the Jews had made against Paul. And so Festus, again, wanting to favor the Jews, said, okay, will you go up to Jerusalem and stand trial? And Paul says, no, sir. I'm where I need to be being tried, in Caesar's court. I'm a Roman citizen. That's the implication there. I've not done anything wrong to the Jews. You know this yourself. If I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I'm not afraid to die. I don't refuse to die. But if these charges are not true, then no one has a right to hand me over to them. So I appeal to Caesar, which was his right as a Roman citizen to appeal to the highest court in the land. So Festus meets with his advisors and says, okay, you've appealed to Caesar, you'll go to Caesar. So that's kind of the first section here of chapter 25. A couple of questions, Matt, for us to consider. First of all, how can you tell that this Jewish religious establishment was just, I call it, obsessed with ridding themselves of the Apostle Paul?
Yeah, so you've got to remember from the previous chapter that Paul was already being held for some time by Felix and getting questioned with him and just prolonging his case. But then 2 years go by and he's still in prison. And you got to just imagine that these religious leaders have been stewing on that this entire time, wishing something would come into play and move on and get Paul out of their lives. But once the new governor has come, you would think that in a leadership meeting of this type that there would be important matters on the table. They would be discussing all kinds of different things. So what has Paul and his case got anything to do with leadership planning or anything of that nature? Not a whole lot. But at the same time, they brought it up. This is something that they view as important. They want to get it addressed with the new person, and they want to get their way.
Yeah, part of me thinks, okay, it's been 2 years. Paul's over there basically rotting in prison. Why can't the Jews just leave him alone? But to me, this just demonstrates how deep-seated their hatred of Paul was. And again, remember, he had been one of them. He had been a Jewish leader. And so maybe there's that idea that they viewed him almost as a traitor. And so they were not going to let this die. And you're right. You would think they would talk about taxation or how do we appeal to you when we have problems, and setting up some kind of liaison between the new Roman governor and the Jewish people. But no, what they're thinking about is, let's deal with this Paul. So it's really amazing if you think about it, that that's seems to be, if not the first thing, it's one of the first things that they bring up to him. Then, excuse me, Paul says, no, I'm not going to Jerusalem. Why was he so unwilling to go to Jerusalem to have his case heard? I mean, he was innocent. He declared his innocence, and he knew that he was innocent. So, but why was he so unwilling to go?
You know, I was thinking about this and trying to put myself in Paul's shoes, and I think my motivation would have been some sense of self-preservation.
Right.
But I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. Um, you know, he's spent time in Jerusalem already. There are Christians in Jerusalem, and he has a right in this case not to go to Jerusalem. So if given the choice between becoming a martyr now and or continuing his gospel journey uh, and taking it to the highest courts of the land, I think he's taking the opportunity that's been given to him. He's got the chance to say, this trial that you're trying to make me have is preposterous. These charges are false. There's nothing of substance here. I'm going to go ahead and go to the highest court in the land. I'm going to go ahead and try to have my case heard before the Roman emperor, the most powerful person in the world. And it kind of goes back to the way that we teach Acts. You know, you describe the way that we start in Jerusalem and then kind of go out from there and then go out to the farthest reaches of the earth. Well, it kind of follows the same pattern in a different dimension. You start off with some very basic ideas of Christianity, and then towards the end of the book of Acts, we're talking about just the legitimacy of the religion in its own right, you know, and where does it fit into the place of the world? So, pretty big moment here for the spread of the faith.
Absolutely. And you may remember too, Jesus had appeared to Paul on one occasion when he was sort of doubting what was going on here with all this commotion back in Jerusalem. And the Lord appeared to him and said, don't worry, I'll be with you. You're going to Rome. You're going to be able to get to Rome. So Paul said, hey, I'm not going back. I'm not heading that direction. I'm heading this direction. But you're right. I don't think it was just a matter of I'm afraid to die. And the reason I know that is because what he says next. He says, if I have done anything deserving death, that I'm not hesitant to die. So why was this statement about death and dying so important to really his defense before this court setting?
Couple things kind of come to mind. I mean, it's setting the stage for some of his later discussion about Christianity that you'll probably see a little bit more in the next chapter. But that's just his mindset and what basically should be the mindset that we all strive to have. There's nothing that's going to stand in our way, not even death, when it comes to being heard outright, and how our faith is the reason for that. But as far as, you know, his defense goes, it basically just invalidates their charges, right? Yeah. I mean, they had nothing to stand on. They're trying to make him face the death penalty. He's saying, well, I'm not afraid of it because you've got nothing.
Yeah. You've made these charges, but there's no proof. And so, hey, you know, I don't deserve to die. I'm willing to die if I've done anything wrong. If you could prove I've done something wrong, then I'm not afraid of death. I don't think he's saying he's afraid of death. And I don't think anything he was doing was showing that he feared death, but rather he's just proving his innocence, I think, by making that claim. Hey, if I'm wrong, you know, I deserve to die, but I'm not wrong. I think that's at least in terms of his defense, that's the point that he is making here. And it's a pretty powerful point. I mean, you think about it, he's before a group of people, before these Roman authorities who had the power to kill him. So he's saying, go for it. You can't prove it. So it's a pretty powerful defense to me. And again, it also just points up Paul's courage, and which was emboldened by the presence, the continuing and ongoing presence of the Lord. This understanding that the Lord was with him every step of the way. And if we remember that, and just in terms of application here, if we remember that, as you pointed out, it emboldens us as well. It ought to. And we ought not worry if people are, certainly most of us have never faced anything like the possibility of death because of our faith, but we've certainly faced maybe people that would just sort of shun us or scorn us or ridicule us, mock us in some way, or just dismiss us. But the abiding presence of the Lord ought to give us courage in any of those kinds of situations. Well, in the next section here, we're introduced to this King Agrippa who shows up. His full name is King Herod Agrippa II, and Bernice, who actually is his sister. And they arrive at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. There's a new governor in town, and Herod Agrippa II is the Herodian king over this region. And so to pay respects, they visit him, much like when a new government official takes office in our country. There might be dignitaries that come and offer congratulations and build relationships and so forth. And let me just pause right here and let's give you just a little bit of background about Agrippa. Agrippa was in the Herodian dynasty. And what that means is, going back to Herod the Great was his great-grandfather. You may remember that Herod the Great was the one when the Christ child was born, and the Magi from the east go to him to try to find out where this baby is. Herod puts out this decree that children under a certain age would be killed in Bethlehem. So that's that Herod. This is his great-grandson, Agrippa is. His uncle was the Herod who had John the Baptist imprisoned and ultimately beheaded. Okay, so that's another generation away. And then his father, Agrippa the First, he's not called Agrippa in the book of Acts, he's called Herod in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 12, is the one who has James executed, and then Peter imprisoned when he finds out that his execution of James was pleasing to the Jews. So he imprisons Peter, and Peter is, of course, miraculously released from prison in Acts 12. So this is a generational thing with this guy, okay? He comes from this long line of Herod. So they're spending some days there. So Festus discusses Paul's case with Agrippa. And we'll talk about why he does that here in just a moment. He says, there's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner a couple of years ago. I go to Jerusalem. They bring these charges against him, ask that he be condemned to death. I said, it's not our custom, it's not our tradition, it's not our law to hand somebody over before their case is heard and charges are brought against them and they have an opportunity to defend themselves. So he says, I didn't delay the case. I convened the court and brought the man in. They get up, but they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion, and this is interesting, about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. So this kind of tells us Festus doesn't really understand what's going on here. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there, but he appealed to Caesar, and so I've got him held until I can get him to Caesar. So Agrippa says, I'd like to hear this man myself. So he says, okay, tomorrow you will. So why do you think Festus got King Agrippa involved in this case? Obviously, he got involved almost incidentally because he came to visit Festus. But why did Festus bring all this up with Agrippa?
Yeah, they're sitting around talking shop, right?
Right.
As leaders do, but it's hard to speculate kind of what Festus's familiarity is with the Judean area and history. You got to expect that he's got some kind of basic understanding of it, but maybe he didn't. And I think what he says about the whole situation kind of demonstrates that he doesn't understand a whole lot of, especially around Jesus.
Right.
But as they're talking about it, Agrippa is the one who says, I would like to hear this man. I'd like to hear myself. But I think Festus would have completely been on board with that. It's like, yeah, absolutely. This is crazy. You got to check this out.
Yeah. I'm told in my study of this that Agrippa was considered by the Romans as being a kind of an expert on the Jews. And if you think about his family history and his interaction with the Jews, their interaction with the Jews down through the years, he is sort of a descendant of all the things that have happened in the life of Jesus and this whole movement about Christ, which they viewed as a movement of the Jews. And in reality, it's kind of where that Christianity came from. And so it makes sense that Festus would have asked Agrippa or discussed this matter with Agrippa because of Agrippa's background. And surely he knew that background. But what insight does Festus show about this case as he discusses this matter with Agrippa?
So he's picked up on the fact that it's a theological difference, and I think that's pretty important. He's like, look, that this has nothing to do with the law. These guys, I think if given his preference, he would like to just see these people not in his courtroom and have it work it out themselves. But clearly, they want to kill Paul,
right?
And so he's kind of keeping it under his control so that it doesn't get out of hand. But he's got the right perspective on it. It's like these guys are disagreeing about something theological with something that they don't agree about in their own religion.
Right. Yeah. And of course, this whole phrase, this is about a dead man named Jesus who Paul says is alive. The idea that a Roman would believe in the miraculous and the afterlife and the resurrection of the dead and all that would have been kind of foolish, really, for a pagan Roman to believe that. Yeah. So it's almost like he's mocking this in a way, but he does. You're right. He points out that this isn't really a legal matter. This is more of I don't know if we'd call it a provincial matter or a as you pointed out, a theological discussion as much as anything. And then that brings up this question, which we may have kind of answered already. I don't know, but what misunderstanding does he demonstrate in what he reports to the king?
So I think, it goes back to this statement. He's trying to understand what it is, and he knows that it centers around this understanding of, well, who is Jesus? Is he alive or is he dead? And this is the whole matter that the Jews are hung up on. But he doesn't know how to investigate it.
Right.
Does it need to be investigated? And so I think he's got a little bit of a hang up there. He doesn't know what to do next.
Yeah, I mean, that's his words. He says, I was at a loss as to even how to investigate this, much less how to adjudicate it. I didn't even know how to investigate. How do you investigate whether someone's dead or alive if you don't, if you can't prove all those kind of things? I think that's the whole point there. He just misunderstood the theological implications of it, I think, to a certain extent, even though he admitted it was a theological discussion. I don't think he really grasped the gravity of the whole thing. He was just trying to be pragmatic from a Roman standpoint in getting this case settled and dealing with the Jews to keep them happy and to avoid any kind of big long-term issue with them. Well, then the end of this chapter, and by the way, each of these chapters the last couple of weeks have kind of left us hanging, and this one's going to leave us hanging a little bit too about what happens next in chapter 26, and then on in the last couple of chapters of the book. But so the very next day, as promised, there's this procession of dignitaries that come in. Agrippa and Bernice come in. The Bible says with great pomp, and they enter this audience room, probably a room where these kinds of hearings and official proceedings would have taken place on a regular basis. There's high-ranking military officials that come in, other prominent people, and Festus is there. He likely would have been the first one to come in as the governor, sort of presiding over all this. And then Paul's brought in. And so Festus says, King Agrippa and all who are present, you see this man. The whole Jewish community, probably an exaggeration there, but the whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not live any longer. I had found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But, he says, I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For it's unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. Okay, so this is sort of the setting at the end of chapter 25. So, what picture was Luke painting with his description of this scene with the king and his sister coming in with great pomp and all these officials and so forth? What point is he making to those that would be reading this book, especially Theophilus and others that would have read this book about the history of the development of the Christian faith? What's he saying here with this contrast between Paul and all these officials?
I think Luke does a great job of doing this throughout the entire book of Acts, the same way that the gospel writers did. If you look through the Gospels, you can see a pretty clear contrast between the established religious leaders of the day and what Jesus was trying to teach. As you kind of go through Luke, you have more of that picture getting developed of how much Christianity shakes up the status quo. But in this specific instance, he's painting this picture of this regal outpouring of wealth, outpouring of time, and this huge pomp and circumstance thing where the leaders of the world at that time are getting their attention on the humble nature of Christianity. So when Paul comes out, he is this malnourished man in chains and rags in the midst of all this gold and velvet and power and swords and stuff, and it's just, he's out of place, but at the same time he's about to really get their attention.
Yeah, and even though he is the one in chains, and he's this one pitiful kind of looking character here, we're going to find out, and again, this is a little bit of foreshadowing of what's to come, but we're going to find out that he's really the one in charge. Why? Because God was with him. And I think the overarching idea here is that, yes, there's power in a king and his family. There's power in a mighty government that ruled the world like Roman, but all of that bows at the feet of the power of God. All authority comes from God. And so there's sort of a subplot that's at play here, that while the Roman officials think that they're in charge, ultimately it's God that's in charge. And that's really an important underlying message that we see really throughout this whole story, beginning in chapter 21, of how Paul winds up getting to Rome. God uses the Romans to get Paul, his messenger, to Rome to preach the gospel. So that's a powerful, powerful thing. Then, as Festus kind of throws this idea open here, what admissions did he make about this case in his comments to the assembly?
Yeah, so he kind of takes that private conversation that he had with Agrippa and makes it public. That he's got, there's nothing really here that I can't explain this case. As the governor, he reports to Rome, right? Mm-hmm. And so if he sends this guy and is expecting the Roman court to put resources into his case and to hear him out and that kind of thing, he needs to have some kind of explanation of why he's going.
Right.
But he doesn't know what to put. It has nothing to do with anything the court normally hears.
Right. Yeah, he's kind of trying to save face. He doesn't want to look like an idiot. by sending the guy to the Supreme Court. So why are you here? Well, I don't really know. The governor just sent me here, whatever. So he wants to have something that he could accuse Paul of, or an explanation for why he's sending him in the first place. Otherwise, the answer from Rome would have been, well, why didn't you just let him go? Why didn't you just set him free? And so he's kind of trying to save face here, and at the same time appease the Jews and keep the peace in his province, because remember, he's only been in power as the governor for just a short period of time, maybe no more than 2 or 3 weeks at this point. Here he is kind of in the very first days of his administration, facing a situation that he just doesn't know what to do with. And that's a pretty strong admission about Paul's innocence, to me, at least. And Luke is making that very clear. Well, as we close this out, and again, Matthew, thank you for your insights. You always, I appreciate the way you look at things and explain things, and the depth of your explanations and so forth. These are just a couple of questions that I want to throw out here for all of us to consider, maybe reflecting type questions, self-examination type questions. I'll ask you, Matt, what's your impression of Festus? As you look at Festus, this governor, what's your initial impression of him?
I don't have a great impression of Festus, to be completely honest. I think, he probably could have handled the situation a lot better, and out of all the things that he needed to focus on in his first crucial weeks as a governor, this is probably not one of them, but at the same time, I'm really glad it happened, because without it, I think Paul's story would have been missing a very important dimension and very important sequence of events that happens after this point. So God knows what he's doing in the grand scheme of things. I kind of look at it, I look at this story from that perspective and say, even though he may not be the right man for the governor position, but he was the right man at the right time. So I kind of try to look at it that way.
He does show some wisdom and courage in that. Number one, I think he brought others into the equation. Remember when right. Paul first made his appeal to Caesar, he confers with his council, his advisors, and then he goes back and confirms, okay, you've appealed to Caesar, you'll go to Caesar. And then he sort of gets the idea or the impression, the input from Felix, and that shows some wisdom. And then he's courageous enough to say, look, I don't think this guy's guilty. But then he shows weakness too. And again, I think we've kind of talked about this, but the very fact that he didn't say, okay, this guy's not guilty, I'm not going to stand for this kind of miscarriage of justice in my administration. Paul, you're free. That was not what he did. He's kind of balancing this idea of doing the right thing according to Roman law versus keeping the peace in Judea and Palestine. And that's a very careful line that he's walking there, at times showing strength, at times showing weakness.
At least he didn't do what Felix did, which...
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Felix was just non-committal, and he kept Paul in limbo.
Right.
Festus here, at least, is moving forward.
Right. How are we like Festus many times, and for that matter, Felix as well? How do you see yourself? Do I see myself as a Festus at times, as a Felix at times? How am I like that at times? I think that's another one of those self-examination questions. There's times when I want to be bold and courageous and do the right thing, and yet because I look around me and I see the circumstances and I think, I'm not sure I should take this stand. Most of the time, we're not on trial for our lives in the same way Paul was, but often we are maybe put in a spot where if we take a stand for the right, then maybe somebody's going to disagree with us, or we're going to cause some waves, some ripples, or people are going to make fun of us or whatever. Do we find ourselves like Festus? I think that's a difficult question for us to consider as we think about how we show forth Jesus Christ in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of us are unprepared for those kinds of situations. We live our lives, we live in the moment, and if something comes up where we're suddenly on trial for our faith, then it could go either way. So I think it's useful for us to consider that potential that at any time we'll be called on to have our faith question.
Exactly. And I'll tell you how I'm like Festus at times. There are times I don't even know where to go to find the answers. And that is an indictment maybe on my Bible study and my investigation into these matters. You know, Festus said, I don't even know how to investigate these matters. And maybe many of us have been asked a question from the Bible or something related to Christianity that we're like, I don't even know where to find that. I don't even know where to look for that. And so it's a challenge to us to be ready, as you say, to be ready to give an answer, which Peter later wrote, for the reason of the hope that's within us. So yes, I am sometimes like Festus, sadly enough. And so that's why it's important that I need to continually study these matters and be ready when those opportunities arise. Well, then this final question, and again, the self-examination question. If you or I were on trial for acknowledging that Jesus is alive and well, what evidence would be presented to prove or disprove the case? Any reflections on that, Matt?
Well, I think in the courts of the human mind, and actions speak louder than words.
Mm-hmm.
And where you spend your time, where you spend your attention, where you spend your money, or your actions, your everyday actions, really speaks a lot more than anything that you could say for yourself. And I think God, to some degree, looks at things that way too. So it's important to consider that.
Exactly. And we need to remember that someone is always watching us. Someone is, in a sense, we are always on trial for our faith. Maybe not in the same sense that Paul was before Roman officials or in a formal court, but in a sense, we are always on trial, as you point out, acknowledging our faith, acknowledging that Jesus is alive and that we are his followers, by our priorities that we set, by the things we say, and certainly by the actions that we demonstrate from day to day. So that's a challenge for us, and maybe we just need to be reminded of that there is someone watching us, and that we do show forth our faith in Jesus by the way we live from day to day. Well, Matt, thank you. You have been again, very insightful into this lesson. I appreciate your insights, your preparation and study. This is such a rich study, this whole study of the book of Acts. And there's so many, sometimes history can be sort of drab and dull, but this is an exciting story of how it's unveiling and opening up before us. And again, we see the hand of God throughout all this, working in and through not only the life of Paul, but his companions, and then before that, even others of the apostles as they were spreading the gospel. So thank you for joining. I hope that you guys are doing well, you and Mary Beth. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Seems like I heard some good news about you guys recently.
Sure did. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're expecting baby Wallace in March. So
that's exciting. Congratulations. And we're very, very happy. We'll be praying for a safe and happy pregnancy. Certainly.
Thank you.
God bless. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. And again, we at the Red Bank Church of Christ, if there's anything we can ever do to help you or to answer questions you have, please get in touch with us. And we will be glad to investigate these matters more fully with you. And we encourage you to study more and more from not only the book of Acts, but throughout the Bible, to know what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining us today, and God bless.